The Apache woman slept in my barn. By morning she was in my bed. Before we ride into this tale, hit that like button and drop a comment telling us where you're tuning in from. The wind had started to turn mean as the sun bled down behind the plains, frost rolling in from the far hills like a warning. Koa Redhawk had already hauled the last load of firewood into the cabin and stoked the hearth to hold through the night. Smoke from the chimney flattened under the gusts blowing sideways, telling any man who could read the sky that bad weather was closing fast. Koa didn't like surprises anymore. Not out here. He stood by the window, arms crossed, staring past his own tired reflection into the dark yard beyond. The barn crouched about 40 yards away under the weight of half-melted snow and storm season repairs. His father, Naka Flintstep, had built it with raw timber and a mule team back in '59, and Koa had been patching it ever since. He was supposed to be resting after a long day digging fence posts and splitting frozen logs, but the silence outside gnawed at him. The air felt heavy with moisture, the temperature dropping harder than it should. He could feel it in his joints and in the old bullet scar along his ribs. Trouble was moving in with the wind. He pulled on his heavy wool coat collar, stiff from years of sweat, and weather shoved his bare feet into boots, grabbed the lantern from its nail by the door, and lit it from the hearth. The wind tried to snuff the flame as soon as he stepped outside, but he hunched over the glass and kept going. Snow hadn't started yet, but it was on its way. Rain first, then sleet, then something meaner before daylight. The ground was already half-frozen slick with patches of mud that hadn't dried. His boots thudded through the yard as the wind cut through his coat. He didn't rush. Rushing in the dark got a man hurt. He moved steady eyes scanning, narrowing as he neared the barn. Inside the dark was softer, warmer. The smell of hay and horse sweat grounded him. Familiar. The horses stirred when he entered, their ears flicking toward the light. He set the lantern on a beam nail and made a slow circuit checking doors, grain sacks, feed buckets. Everything looked in order until he caught it out of the corner of his eye a change in the shape of the hay pile by the far wall. Not enough to be obvious, but off. He moved closer, quiet. No need to spook anything. The horses stayed calm. Whatever it was hadn't frightened them. He rounded the stall corner and lifted the lantern higher. At first he didn't register what he was seeing. She was so still she could have been part of the haystack except for the color of her skin and the way her fingers clutched a filthy blanket like a lifeline. She wasn't asleep. Her eyes were wide open, locked on him. Unmoving breath coming hard through her nose. Her hair hung long and black, tangled across one shoulder. What was left of her dress was soaked through, torn at the collar, and shoulder ripped across the thigh. Her knees were drawn up tight to her chest. Bare feet, red with cold and caked with mud ankles, scratched and bleeding. One shoulder already bruising, lip split. She'd run through thorns, rocks, maybe worse. Apache blood, Koa could tell. Young, maybe mid-20s, maybe less hard to say under all that dirt and exhaustion. He didn't speak. Neither did she. He stepped back slowly, hands where she could see them. No sudden moves. His mind ran through the possibilities. She could be a runaway from some settler's homestead, or from something worse. Out here, justice had sharp edges and long shadows. One thing he knew for certain, she was terrified. No bandit would huddle barefoot and bleeding in his barn. She wasn't here to harm him. "You're safe in here tonight," Koa said, his voice low and measured. She didn't answer, didn't blink, just watched. He knelt by a crate, keeping his distance, pulled from his coat pocket, a strip of venison jerky and half a piece of cornbread he'd meant to eat on the fence line earlier. He set it on a cloth and stepped back. He had no water on him, so he left the lantern burning where she could see it and slipped out into the storm again. At the cabin, he filled a tin canteen from the pot by the hearth and returned. She hadn't moved when he came back. He left the canteen near the food, then stepped back toward the stalls and sat on a bale of hay, silent. They stayed like that for long minutes. No words, just the wind outside, the rustle of hay, and the slow breathing of the horses. Eventually, she shifted. Picked up the bread first, then the meat. Ate slowly, cautiously, like she expected it to be taken away again. When she reached for the water, her hand trembled. She drank only a little, just enough to wet her mouth. Her eyes never left him. When she finished eating, she wrapped the blanket tighter around herself and turned away from him. That Koa Redhawk figured was the closest thing to trust he'd earned that night. He didn't ask her name, didn't press. Instead, he rose without a sound, grabbed the lantern, and left the barn door bolted from the outside but not latched shut. He didn't know why. Just felt it shouldn't be. Back inside the cabin, Koa peeled off his coat, fed the fire, until the flames licked high, then sat at the table alone in the dark. He poured a cup of cold coffee, stared into it for a long while before finally taking a sip. He'd been running this ranch solo for almost 6 years now, not since his brother Tiva Snow Eye died in that horsefall. His father Naka Flintstep followed not long after heart failure and a cruel winter. No wife, no children, no kin nearby. He only went to town when he had to. Folks in town called him a loner. They weren't wrong. But it wasn't about hiding. He was just tired. Tired from war. He'd ridden with a volunteer company back in the early 70s, seen the kind of blood and ruin that stuck to a man's bones. Things along the border he never spoke of. When it ended, he came back to the land that had raised him, hoping it might make sense of the world when nothing else did. The war had ended. But the land still needed tending, and now there was a woman half frozen, half broken, sleeping in his barn. He didn't sleep that night. Not really. Each gust of wind pulled his eyes to the window. Every snap of the fire made him straighten in his chair. The rifle stayed close, leaning by the door, not because of her, because of whoever might be coming for her. At first light after the storm eased, and a pale wash of daylight crept across the plains, Koa dressed without making a sound and stepped out into the cold. She was still there. But something had changed. The food was gone, the water too. She'd swept part of the barn clean stacked hay into a neater pile. When he stepped inside, she was up, limping slightly, her leg still bleeding. The bruises on her shoulder stood out worse under the weak daylight. He moved toward her, slowly, steady as ever. She turned when she noticed him. Still cautious, but she didn't shrink back. That was something. He nodded toward her leg. Needs cleaning. She didn't speak, just stood silent. He walked to the far corner, filled the wash basin from the barrel, tore a strip of cloth from an old undershirt, and pulled out a small tin of salve he usually kept for the horses when they tangled with barbed wire. Then he waited. Gave her space. Eventually she moved to the rail near the stall, sat stiffly, and stretched her leg out. Her whole body stayed wound tight, her expression locked and unreadable. But she let him near. Koa didn't say a word. Just worked. He cleaned the cut, wiped away the mud and dried blood. She flinched once but didn't cry out. It wasn't a deep wound, but it was raw. If it had gone another day, it would have turned bad. He bandaged it tight, then stepped back. She glanced up, met his eyes for a heartbeat, then looked away again. He didn't push her, just said, "I'll bring food later," and turned to go. She went back to sweeping like nothing had happened, That night he left the cabin door unlocked, just in case. But she didn't come in. Not yet. The second morning cracked open with a sky like brittle glass and frost feathering the windows. The storm had passed, but the air had that stillness after a blow where sound travels far and everything feels like it's listening. Koa stood over the stove, frying bacon in a cast-iron pan. His jaw was tight, eyes far away. He wasn't hungry, hadn't slept more than an hour. But he cooked anyway. The routine kept him grounded, kept his thoughts from wandering where they didn't belong. He wrapped half the food in a clean cloth, poured water into a tin cup, and stepped out into the thawing mud. The prairie stretched wide and gray beneath the cold morning sun. A few crows picked through scraps near the fence line. Nothing unusual, nothing wrong. Still, his stride stayed measured, controlled, the kind that said nothing but watched everything. His stomach twisted all the same. She was there again before he reached the door. The horses stirred alert, not uneasy. They knew her now. She'd either stayed quiet all night or he'd just been too damn tired to notice. Inside, she wasn't curled up anymore. She was standing. Wrapped in a horse blanket she'd taken off the rail facing the stall, watching one of the mares chew lazily near her feet. Koa paused in the doorway, food in hand. "You eat?" She turned slightly but didn't answer. He walked over to the same hay bale he'd used the day before, placed the bundle and the tin cup down without saying anything else. If she was hungry, she'd eat. She had that survivor's edge about her. Then he noticed the hay had been rearranged again. Cleaner. The tool's pitchfork, shovel, rusted egg basket had been moved. Not randomly. Placed. Organized. She'd been working. He eyed her leg. "You opened that cut again?" Still no answer. But when she stepped forward, the limp told him enough. He didn't scold, just fetched the basin, warmed some water, and knelt again. She moved toward him, slow and careful, but with purpose. When she finally sat down, Koa Redhawk unwrapped the bandage. Her skin twitched at the touch of cold cloth, but she didn't flinch. "Looks better," he muttered. "You've had worse." She gave a small shrug. Not defiant, just true. He could see it, this wasn't her first time bleeding. As Koa cleaned the wound, his thoughts drifted to the questions that had been burning since that first night. Where had she come from? Who had she run from? What kind of hell had she passed through to end up here? With no horse, no coat, no boots, not even a blade, nobody chose that path. That was the kind of escape where the only thing you carry is the breath in your chest and the direction that looks least like death. But he didn't ask. Not yet. Instead, he broke the silence. "You stay here," he said, voice steady. "Folks are going to start wondering." He didn't sugarcoat it. "You know how it is, an Indian girl on a white man's land. They don't ask. They assume." Her eyes lifted. Not frightened. Not offended. Just sharp. Watching him close now. "I'm not trying to own anyone," he continued. "If you walk out that door, I won't stop you. But if you stay, you live by the rules." She didn't move. Just stared. "You work, you eat, you don't touch my rifle." He let that settle before adding, "And I don't lie for folks. If someone comes knocking, I'll hear 'em out. But I'm not taking a bullet for something I don't understand." Silence stretched. Then just once, she nodded. It wasn't submission. It was negotiation. Terms exchanged without words. And he understood them. Koa wrapped the bandage snug and stood. The days that followed slipped into a quiet kind of rhythm. She didn't run. She didn't hide. Instead, she started moving with purpose. She fed the chickens, hauled feed sacks, swept the coop, even dragged water from the well leg injury and all, She never complained. She just did the work. And Koa knew with every passing day the risk crept higher. She looked Apache. No mistaking it. Her bone structure, her skin, her silence. She was a walking provocation to the kind of men who rode out from town carrying rope and self-righteousness. But Koa had already chosen. The first night, if he'd been the kind of man to throw her back to the cold, he never would have lit the lantern, never would have fed her, never would have spoken gently. She stirred something he hadn't let rise in years. A part of him he'd buried after the war, back when orders came from ghosts and punishments came by torchlight. He still saw her in flashes, another girl long ago, whose bare feet swung lifeless from a telegraph pole outside El Paso. He'd been younger then, dumber. He hadn't stopped it. He wouldn't make that mistake again. One evening right before sundown, he saw her behind the cabin. Not close, just standing still in the grass, watching the horizon like it might speak. He'd been splitting kindling, stopped when he noticed her. "You expecting someone?" he asked, wiping sweat from his brow. She didn't answer. Just kept her eyes fixed west, where the land folded in waves and the sky bled purple behind the ridge. Koa followed her gaze. Saw nothing. No riders, no smoke. Just whined through the dry cottonwoods. "You got someone chasing you?" Still nothing. But her jaw tightened. Her fingers gripped the edge of the blanket she wore like armor. She wasn't angry, just worn down. "If you won't talk," he said, voice low, "I can't help you much more. I've given you time-space. But if someone dangerous is out there, someone who'd cross all that land to find you, I need to know." She didn't move, didn't blink. Then finally she spoke. Her voice was quiet, dry. "No one's coming." That was it, but it was enough. He believed her. That night after dinner, she stood in the yard again. Same spot, same distance, same quiet weight in her posture. Koa didn't say a word. He just left the cabin door unlocked. She didn't step inside. Not yet. But she was thinking about it. 2 days later, the wind shifted again, this time sharper, cutting down from the north. He didn't need a thermometer to know what that meant. The first real snow was coming. He felt it in the hush of dawn, in the way the dirt cracked under his boots, in the way the birds went quiet without a sound. That morning, Koa stood on the cabin porch with a tin cup of coffee cooling in his hands, eyes fixed on the barn across the yard. She was already awake. Koa Redhawk had seen her silhouette moving behind the slats just after dawn. 3 nights had passed since she'd first appeared. She hadn't stepped inside the house yet, but each evening brought her a little closer. That meant something, even if she never said a word. Inside the barn, Asha Rainbird was filling a tin pail with feed, limping slightly but steady in her purpose. She moved with quiet intention. Didn't wait for orders. Didn't need direction. Koa stepped into the barn, watching for a beat before speaking. "You know your way around animals?" he asked. She didn't look up. "Some," she replied. Her voice had more weight now. Still careful, still guarded, but no longer so raw. Koa gave a slow nod. That explained why the horses hadn't raised a fuss the night she slipped in. She had the calm steadiness of someone used to livestock. Not gentle exactly, but measured. No panic, no waste. Her steps were quiet, her hands patient. He'd seen grown men rattle a mare with just their shadow, but not her. She scooped grain into the trough, then stepped back. The mare eased forward and started eating. "You from nearby?" he asked. No. That was it. No added details, no name offered. Koa didn't press. It was too early for the day for whatever fragile trust was forming between them. He wasn't about to shatter it by prying. But something was shifting. She wasn't just some runaway huddling in the hay. She was beginning to move like she belonged. Not by title, not by law, but by the way she took up space, noticing what needed fixing, and doing it without a word. Broken latch mended, empty water buckets filled, woodpile restacked neater than before. She even salted the last of the pork from the cellar without being asked. Koa hadn't invited her to stay, but she hadn't left either. And truth be told, he didn't want her to. Not because of comfort. Not for company. It was something tougher to define. Like survival in tandem. Like two folks not choosing each other but realizing they had the same fight. And the more she helped, the harder it became to picture the place without her. That afternoon, while mending fence on the north side, Koa kept glancing toward the ridge. Not because he expected anyone. Not really. But he knew what fear and boredom could do to men, especially when righteousness got involved. Last spring, Whit Halloran had ended up 6 feet under for sheltering a girl on the run. She wasn't Apache, but close enough for gossip. Law let it slide. Town didn't. No one would trade with his widow. Took months for the dust to settle. Koa understood the risk. He'd counted the cost. Still, every time he saw the way Asha limped but kept moving, never once asking for pity, he circled back to the same thought she deserved a shot at peace. Just like anybody else. That evening, she came in with a handful of warm brown eggs fresh from the coop. Didn't say a word. Just handed them to him and lingered by the doorway. "You hungry?" he asked. She hesitated. Then nodded. He stepped back. "Come in, then." It was the first time she crossed the threshold. She didn't gawk, didn't wander, just made for the bench by the hearth and sat upright still. Didn't touch a thing. Didn't settle in. Just waited. Koa cracked the eggs into the skillet, dropped in a strip of bacon, and let the fire do the rest. Smoke and grease filled the room like a memory. He slid a tin plate in front of her. She picked up the fork slowly, then started eating. Still silent. But the silence felt different now. Not like fear, more like understanding. He sat across from her. "You got a name." A long pause. Then quietly, "Asha." He nodded. "Koa." They ate without another word. After she helped clean the plates without being told. Then stood by the door unsure again. "You can sleep here tonight," he said. "Warmer than the barn." She didn't reply, but she didn't leave either. When he spread the extra blanket near the stove, she lay down without hesitation. He took the bed. No argument. No shifting of roles. That night he watched her through the firelight. Eyes closed. Breathing steady. Not broken. Not some helpless stray. Just another soul trying to make it through. Like him. Snow fell silent in the night. No wind. No warning. Just a hush that wrapped the prairie in white by dawn. When Koa Redhawk opened the cabin door that morning, the world was still. The barn roof, the chicken run, the fences all softened under a pale blanket. He glanced back toward the hearth. Asha Rainbird was still sleeping, curled near the flames. One arm curled beneath her head, her long black hair spilling across the worn floorboards like a shadow at dusk. She hadn't stirred once through the night. 5 nights had passed since she first arrived. Just 2 since she'd stepped inside the cabin. This was her 2nd night beneath the same roof. Koa Redhawk hadn't insisted. He'd simply opened the door. She'd stepped in, no words, no expectations. But ever since the air inside had felt different. He brewed coffee in the quiet dawn. The scent rose before the warmth did. It reached her in sleep, rousing her slowly. She blinked at the window, then turned toward him. No alarm in her eyes. Just a calm steadiness as she pulled the blanket tighter across her shoulders. He handed her a tin cup. She accepted it like it carried more weight than it should have, sipped slow, said nothing. But the way her shoulders eased just a little was louder than words. He set a pan of oats on the stove, cracked the last 2 eggs into the skillet. Snow had come early. Usually sticks till March, he said. At first, Asha Rainbird didn't respond. Then softly, sometimes longer, he nodded. Sometimes. She didn't seem surprised or scared, just accepting. Whatever she'd run from was far behind her now. Snow and silence made sure of that. If anyone had chased her, they weren't making it through that storm. Not without horses, not without knowing where to look. And Koa was sure no one out there had a clue she was here. Still, he kept alert, moved the rifle from above the hearth to the wall beside the door. Each morning before tending the animals, he circled the cabin eyes, scanning sharp. Any tracks would be plain as daylight in that fresh powder. But there were none. Not even deer, just the prints she left when she arrived barefoot in the snow. He hadn't stepped on them, hadn't swept them away. Somehow he wanted them there, a quiet reminder of what she'd survived. After breakfast, she helped with the dishes. Her limp had eased, the bruises had lightened, and the way she moved, less like someone hiding, more like someone finding her footing. "You ever use a saw?" he asked. She turned, caught off guard, then gave a single nod. "Good," he said, reaching for the smaller bow saw from the wall. Stack kindling by the porch. 2 rows. She took the tool without question. No? How much? No, why? Just stepped outside and got to it. By midday, 2 clean rows of cut wood stood firm beside the wall. Her fingers were raw and red, the saw having worn past her calluses, but she didn't say a word. She came in, laid the saw down gently, and stood near the stove until the tremble left her hands. Koa watched her quietly as he stitched a leather strap. Something about her brought back memories he hadn't let surface in years. His mother had been like that. Quiet. Comanche blood raised in a mission near Santa Fe before marrying his father. She'd never said much at church in town, but she could read a room better than any preacher. Used to say stillness was its own kind of voice. You just gotta sit long enough to hear it. He hadn't thought of Amma Palefox in years, not since the cholera swept through in 75. But somehow Asha stirred that same kind of quiet. Not silence born of fear, but of presence. She wasn't hiding. She was anchoring herself. She didn't pry, didn't ask. But she noticed everything. She'd tightened the blankets without being told, oiled the stove hinges, rearranged the shelf jars lined up by size quiet, exact, careful. That night after supper, Koa poured 2 cups of coffee, handed her one, sat by the fire, elbows on knees, and finally let the words fall that had been weighing on him since the snow came. "You planning to stay through the winter?" Asha stared into the fire, then turned to Koa. Her gaze held no fear, only a quiet certainty. "If I can." He nodded. "Then we'll need to make what we've got last, and I'll need a hand fixing the roof before the next snow." "I'll help," she said simply. No hesitation, no second guessing, no need to ask if she was welcome. It wasn't a discussion. Just the truth said out loud. They didn't say much else that evening. The fire crackled, and the wind whispered through the shutters like a warning from the mountain. It was the sound of distance, of how alone they truly were. Before bed, Koa laid out the extra blanket again. Asha stood beside it a moment, then stepped toward the fire. Without a word, she slipped off the coat she'd worn all day and lay down once more, closer this time. Closer to him. He didn't move. He just watched her breathing soften, and somehow, he slept better that night than he had in years. By week's end, the cold had sunk its teeth into the land. At sunrise, snow crusted over hard enough to carry weight. The sky had gone gray and stayed that way for days. Koa Redhawk knew the signs. Winter was here for real. Every day now ran like clockwork. First, stoke the fire. Second, brew the coffee. Third, haul water from the half-frozen well behind the barn. The stove wasn't just comfort, it was survival. So were hot meals. So were thick coats and dry boots. So was watching the pantry shelf like it held the last sand in the hourglass. He'd taken inventory twice: beans, cornmeal, salt, pork. Dried apples, flour. Enough coffee if he stretched it. If he brought in meat before the next whiteout, they might make it to February without touching the emergency stash. But he wouldn't manage it alone. Luckily, he wasn't alone anymore. Asha had taken to the rhythm of the place without a word of protest. Koa noticed it in how she moved. She no longer paused at the door or looked around before crossing the yard. She walked like someone who respected the land, not trying to own it, just belonging to it in the quiet way wild things do. That morning she stood at the chopping block. Sleeves rolled high, hat low. Her breath came in soft clouds as she brought the axe down on a length of frozen wood with clean, practiced strength. Koa watched from the porch a moment, then came toward her with another stack in his arms. "You're splitting clean," he said. "Done this before?" "Yes," she answered, steady and sure. No flinch, no looking away. He dropped the logs with a nod. "Don't have to do it all at once." "I know." He waited a beat, then added, "I've seen grown men split worse." That earned him a flicker at the corner of her mouth. Not quite a smile, but close enough to feel like warmth. They worked in silence till noon. He cleared the snow off the barn roof while she gathered eggs and raked out the chicken coop. They crossed paths at the water barrel, shoulders brushed. Neither one stepped away. Later, Koa fetched down a coil of rope and handed one end to her. Didn't need to explain. The western fence had to be fixed before the next snowfall buried it for good. The ground was hard, the holes stubborn, and he couldn't do it alone. But Asha didn't need convincing. She tied her end without a word, checked the knot, and walked with him into the snow. Their boots crunched through the frost. She didn't ask where they were headed or how long it would take. She just walked. At the fence line, Koa set the first post while she held it straight. They spoke only in hand signals: raise, lower, hold. She never faltered. He noticed the slight limp after a while, the quiet strain in her leg, but she never mentioned it. 3 hours passed before they sat against a half-buried stone, breaking a biscuit and sharing strips of dried meat. No words. Just the sound of winter wind curling around two souls who had started to understand one another without needing to speak. Koa Redhawk watched the pale silver light creep across the sky, the sun already dropping behind the ridge. "You still planning to leave?" he asked, breaking the quiet. Asha Rainbird blinked, took a sip from the canteen, then met his gaze head-on. "Are you asking me to?" "No," Koa said without hesitation. She gave a small nod, taking that in, and went back to chewing the last bite of her biscuit. It was the first time either of them came close to naming what was happening between them, something unspoken, fragile, but real. That night, Asha stepped into the cabin like she belonged there. She hung her coat beside his and settled into the chair by the table while he stirred the stew. When he brought over their plates, she reached across and sprinkled salt into his without asking. He raised an eyebrow. You been watching me that close? She didn't smile. Not quite, but there was a flicker of dry humor in her tone. You like more salt than you let on. That was the most she'd said in one breath. After supper, they didn't retreat to opposite corners. Asha settled near the fire, and at one point their knees brushed. Koa didn't move. He pulled his pocket knife from his belt and began whittling at a scrap of pine, just keeping his hands busy. She watched for a while, then leaned back and closed her eyes. The fire popped gently. Snow whispered against the shutters. Outside, the wind prowled the hills like a hungry spirit. I had a sister, Koa, said his voice low. Asha opened her eyes, didn't speak, just waited. She only made it to 2. Fever took her. After that, my mother stopped speaking much, said the land remembers. Still, Asha said nothing, just listened. Like she understood. Like she knew what it meant to carry silence deeper than words. Koa didn't know why he'd shared it, only that this was the first time it didn't hurt to say it. That night when she laid her blanket down again, it was closer to where he slept. She didn't ask, and he didn't speak. There was still distance, still quiet, but now it felt like something sacred, a silence that allowed space for healing, not separation. Morning came hard. A deep freeze had gripped the valley overnight, and the cabin walls groaned under the weight of frost. Koa woke early, same as always, but his breath curled in the cold air like campfire smoke. The fire had nearly gone out. He moved quickly to bring it back, then glanced toward the spot where Asha had been. She wasn't there. His chest tightened for a split second, not fear exactly, but a flash of old reflex, the kind bred from too much time alone. The door was still latched. Then he spotted the faint frost prints leading toward the corner where the wash basin sat. She was crouched there, sleeves rolled, splashing icy water over her face, her breath hitching at the cold. A wet cloth hung from the edge. She was scrubbing clean. Koa paused, uncertain if he should interrupt. Instead, he turned back to the stove. By the time the fire caught, she had wrapped a spare blanket around her shoulders and stood by the table drying her hands. Her face was more visible now. Wet hair combed back, skin flushed from the water knuckles red from the chill. Her features looked sharper in the light. Weary but alive. You'll freeze yourself doing that, he said softly. She shrugged. Needed it. He understood. Cleanliness wasn't about vanity out here. It was about reclaiming control. They ate in silence. Beans, dry bread, and coffee, black as a cave night. Afterward, Koa went to check on the horses. When he returned, Asha was by the hearth again, massaging her leg slowly. The bandage had slipped. Need me to take a look? He asked. She didn't answer at first, then nodded. He crouched beside her hands, gentle as he unwound the cloth. His fingers brushed her skin, warm and calloused. The wound had split slightly, not bad, but raw and swollen at the edges. Pushed it too hard yesterday, he muttered. She didn't deny it, just stayed still. He dipped a clean rag into warm water, wrung it out, and dabbed gently at the wound. Her breathing shifted, steady but tense. You all right? He asked, glancing up. Yes, she said. Voice quiet but firm. He returned to his work. As he cleaned, he noticed faint scars, one along her shin, a nick near her ankle. Old wounds. She'd run before, maybe even from worse. But whatever Asha Rainbird had been through, she'd weathered it not by breaking down, but by holding fast in silence. When Koa Redhawk finished cleaning the wound, He reached for the tin of salve, scooped out a bit with his fingers, and began rubbing it gently over the raw skin. Her thigh was tense under his hand, but she didn't flinch. The fire popped once, a low crack in the hush of the room. Then her voice, sudden in the stillness, soft but steady. "Why do you help me?" Koa paused, his hand still moving, but he didn't meet her eyes when he answered. "Because no one helped my mother when she needed it." That truth just lingered unchallenged between them, like the smoke curling from the hearth. Asha didn't push for more. She didn't have to. He secured the bandage, tying it tighter this time, then leaned back on his heels. His knees popped with the strain of crouching too long. "You should rest it a day or two," he told her. "I can still work. You don't need to prove anything to me." That got her attention. She looked straight at him, then, not just glancing, but really looking, studying his face like she was trying to read the man behind the words. Not who he said he was, but who he showed himself to be when no one was watching. Koa met her gaze, held it. After a beat, Asha gave a quiet nod. They took it slow that day. No chopping wood, no hauling supplies. Koa repaired worn tools, while Asha sat near the hearth stitching torn saddlecloth with calm, practiced hands. He passed her his mother's old sewing kit without a word. She accepted it just the same. As dusk crept in, wind whispered against the cabin walls, brushing snow like fingers drumming softly from outside. They shared a hot supper, boiled beans, and tough root vegetables, and settled on opposite sides of the fire. Koa stripped and cleaned his rifle. Asha honed the small knife he'd given her earlier. The blade wasn't much easy to tuck away, easy to hide, but in the right hands, it could mean survival. Later, Koa laid out his usual spare blanket near the table. But this time Asha hesitated. She looked at him not afraid, just unsure. A question hung between them unspoken. He didn't say a word. She walked over, picked up a different blanket, and spread it beside the hearth. Closer. Not next to him, but not far either. She curled onto her side, facing the fire. Facing him. Koa didn't move. Didn't speak. But something between them had shifted. The silence wasn't empty now, it was full. Full of decisions, of tentative trust, of words they hadn't spoken yet, but might soon. The fire burned low that night, a slow, steady ember glow, not bright just enough to keep the cold out. Koa sat in his usual chair, fingers curled around a tin cup of untouched coffee eyes drifting between the hearth and the window. Wind whispered beyond the walls. No storm, not yet, but he could feel it coming. Across the room, Asha lay near the fire, eyes open. She wasn't pretending to sleep. She stared into the flames like they carried some truth she needed. Koa had barely spoken all day, partly by habit, partly because he didn't want to break whatever fragile peace had formed between them. Out here, one wrong word could unravel everything. But it was Asha who broke the quiet this time. "Do you miss it?" Her voice was calm, clear. No lead-in. Just the question. Koa looked over, caught off guard, not by the question itself, but that she was asking. "Miss what?" "The way it was before I came." He considered that for a moment. "I thought I liked it," he said. "But maybe it was just the only thing I knew." Asha gave a small nod. She didn't smile, but something shifted in her shoulders. Less bracing. More breathing. "I've been quiet a long time," she said. "I figured." She sat up slowly, knees pulled beneath the blanket, her face lit softly by the fire. Her eyes weren't just tired, they were heavy from carrying too much for too long. Koa leaned forward, forearms on his thighs, voice low. "Did someone hurt you?" He didn't demand, just wanted to understand. Asha didn't flinch, but she took her time before answering. Yes. He nodded. Didn't ask who. Didn't need to. I'm not running anymore, she added quietly. And just like that, something tugged in Koa's chest. Not fear. Just the deep, weighty truth of her words. It wasn't just a statement. It was a vow. It was a choice. One that held weight. They stayed like that for a while, the firelight casting flickers between them. The space between them no longer felt like two strangers keeping distance. It felt like two souls tuning in to one another. Not to the crackle of wood or wind outside, but to something quieter. Presence. Trust. When Koa Redhawk finally rose to place another log on the fire, he moved with care, as though not to break the fragile thread of peace between them. He fed the flames, stirred them gently, and as he turned back toward the cot, Asha Rainbird stood too. He froze. She stepped near. Not just near close enough that he could feel the warmth coming off her skin, even through the chill. She said nothing. Didn't reach, just lifted her eyes to meet his. And somehow that said everything. He didn't speak, didn't flinch. She inched closer just enough so their arms brushed. And then she waited. That's when he did something he hadn't done in years, maybe not since before the war, before everything. He took his coat from the chair and gently draped it over her shoulders. Her breath caught not from fear, but from something tender, something unspoken. She closed her eyes for just a heartbeat, then opened them again. She didn't move away. Neither did he. Then, without ceremony, she leaned into him, her shoulder against his chest forehead, resting lightly against his shirt. No words passed. He instinctively brought his arm around her lightly without claiming. A shelter, not a bind. There was no kiss, no wild rush. Just stillness, just warmth. A comfort deep in the bones. She stayed like that a while. When they finally moved, it was without words. He took his place on one side of the bed. She joined him, not curled beneath but beside, still wrapped in his coat, still choosing to stay. As Koa lay back, Asha followed. Her head near his shoulder, one hand resting on his chest, her fingers curling slightly in the fabric of his shirt. The flicker from the hearth played across the ceiling in soft shadow and light. He didn't reach for her, didn't pull her close, just breathed. Steady, still. She was here. Because she chose to be. That meant more than any vow. By morning they hadn't moved much, just a quiet tangle of limbs and warmth, no words, no regrets, just presence. When Asha stirred, her body was still curled against Koa's. His arm lay around her, not holding just there. For a long moment neither of them moved. The fire had burned low. Soft red coals and silence broken only by the occasional groan of timber above. She sat up first, pulling the coat tighter, looked down at him. He opened his eyes. There was no shock, no awkward scramble. Just a long, calm pause. Something between them had changed, but not broken. Settled. He rubbed his face, stretched his legs, then stood. I'll get the coffee going. She nodded, still wrapped in the blanket. Still warm. Her eyes followed him not with caution, but with understanding, like she saw him clearly now. They didn't speak again until the kettle started to boil. Then, quietly, she asked, "Have you always lived alone?" Koa didn't answer right away. He poured 2 cups, handed her one, sat across from her. "Not always," he said. She waited. "My brother died 6 years back. Stallion kicked him down hard near the pasture. I buried him under the cottonwood tree. He paused. Been just me ever since. Asha didn't speak, but her eyes shifted, and he could see it. She knew that kind of loss. The kind that carved silence into a person's ribs. What about your mother? She asked gently. Half Comanche. Fever took her before the war. My father passed the same year. She stared at him for a while, then nodded quiet. Your land, it's peaceful. That's why I stayed, he replied. She wrapped her hands around the cup, gaze drifting toward the fire. Then she spoke, unprompted. My mother taught me to catch fish before I turned 6, said it was the only way I'd never starve. Her voice was even steady, like the memory was something she'd made peace with. She died in the summer burn. Soldiers came through the canyon hunting raiders. Didn't find any. Burned everything anyway. She didn't go further. She didn't have to. Koa leaned forward, voice soft. I'm sorry. Asha shook her head just once. That was a long time ago. I made it through, Asha Rainbird said quietly. But the silence afterward, it spoke louder than the screams ever did. Koa Redhawk didn't respond right away. He didn't need to. He'd lived in that silence for most of his life. It had settled into his bones like winter frost, and he knew all too well the weight it carried. That morning they shared breakfast without hurry. There was no rush, no tension, just the quiet ease of people who no longer felt like strangers. Afterward, Asha took the egg basket and stepped out into the snow. Koa leaned against the porch post and watched her. She moved with purpose, but not urgency. She moved like she belonged. The chickens stirred but didn't scatter. They knew her now. She knelt, whispering something he couldn't quite hear. Maybe not even English. It sounded like an old comfort passed down in another tongue. They spent the day side by side, each lost in their own quiet task. But the silence was no longer empty. It was full with trust, with presence. He showed her how to manage the chimney flue in bitter wind. She taught him how to twist cloth into fire starters, just as her mother once had. That night, beside the fire, Asha handed the knife back to him. Something wrong? He asked, brow raised. She shook her head slowly. No, I trust you now. Koa looked down at the blade for a long beat, then gently pressed it back into her hand. Keep it. There was no need for more words. The next evening she didn't wait for the fire to fade or the night to grow still. She simply walked over to the bed and lay beside him. No shame, no hesitation. Koa followed, pulling the blanket over them both. In the darkness, their hands met. Not clinging, just resting together. Later she murmured a word against his chest, a name. One he didn't recognize, a language he didn't speak. But the sound carried sorrow. Memory. Meaning. He didn't ask what it meant. She'd offered him a piece of herself. That was enough. By week's end, the cabin didn't feel like his anymore. It felt like theirs. The tools were still in place, but arranged differently now, cleaner, more intentional. The floor got swept more often. The silence was no longer awkward. It was alive. Every movement a quiet statement. I'm still here. I'm not going anywhere. Outside, the land froze under thick snow. But inside, something was thawing, slow, steady, and real. A thing they hadn't named yet, but both of them felt it growing. The sky hung heavy for days. Gray and cold, thick with a promise of more snow. And then the peace shattered. On the third morning of the second week, Koa was out by the fence line, checking after the windstorm. Asha was back near the coop, tending the birds. It was cold, but still. Quiet. Then Koa saw them. 3 riders on the eastern ridge crossing slow. Not charging, not working, just drifting. But their shapes were off. Too clean, too stiff. One wore a tall hat, not a rancher's. The other 2 had long, dark coats. No sacks, no tools, no game strapped behind. Just rifles. Koa didn't wave, didn't call. He slipped behind a low rise into the tree line, eyes tracking their path, until they vanished behind the bluff. His hands were calm, but his gut tightened like a pulled bowstring, not fear readiness. He moved quick through the trees, boots crunching hard against the frozen ground. When he burst through the cabin door, Asha was already looking at him. She'd read it on his face. 3 riders, he said. East Ridge. She didn't flinch, but her breath hitched. Do you know them? He asked. No, she replied softly. You sure? She nodded. But they're not just passing through. They're looking. Yeah, Koa muttered, moving to the weapons rack. I figured. He checked the rifle, then the sidearm. Both were loaded. Both were ready. Asha Rainbird stood by the stove, her hand still wrapped around the wooden spoon she'd been stirring before Koa Redhawk came through the door. Do you want me to leave? She asked. Her voice was steady, but there was steel under it. Not fear, not desperation, just quiet strength. Koa turned to her, really looked. No, he said simply. She held his gaze for a long beat. If they ask, what do you tell them? I tell them I'm not hiding anyone, he said. Which is the truth. You're not hiding anymore. That softened her expression, if only slightly. But still they took precautions. He led her outside down the slope behind the barn, showing her the narrow trail that ran through the pines. The dip in the ground would help cover tracks better than the open snow. It wasn't an escape plan, just preparation. He left the rifle inside, but kept his revolver close. Wore it plainly when he went to split wood that afternoon. He didn't want to look like he was expecting trouble, but he damn sure wanted anyone watching to know he wasn't an easy mark. The riders didn't return that day, but their shadow lingered. That night, after chores were done and the lamps had burned low, Asha didn't curl up by the fire. She walked to the bed with quiet purpose, each step steady, her eyes unwavering. Koa stood by the stove for a long second, feeling the weight of everything unsaid. Then he followed, sitting beside her. If they come, she said softly, and if they bring others, don't let them take me. Her voice didn't waver. She wasn't begging, wasn't pleading, just laying down the one thing she couldn't survive. I won't, Koa replied. She reached for his hand, and he let her take it. That night they didn't sleep much. They lay close, sharing heat, listening to the wind whisper across the roof. And in that stillness something new rooted itself in Koa's chest. Not dread, not suspicion, but something sharper. A decision. What would he do? How far would he go to protect this woman who'd walked into his life without warning? He hadn't asked her to come. He hadn't expected it. But she was here now, and whatever it was they were building, quiet, unfinished, fragile, was more real than anything he'd known in years. She wasn't a guest. She wasn't passing through. She was home. And now that he knew what that meant, he'd fight to keep it. Not from fear. Not from the past. Not from men with questions. The riders returned on the 4th day. No posse. No rush. Just 2 this time, the tall one in a clean coat and another with narrow eyes who sat too high in the saddle like a man who'd never worked real dirt in his life. They weren't looking to start a gunfight, but they didn't bother to hide their rifles either. Koa saw them before they hit the gate. He didn't run. He stood in plain sight, coat on revolver at his hip, one hand resting on the fence rail. Asha wasn't visible just as they'd planned. She watched from the curtain. The lead rider tipped his hat. "Mornin'," Koa gave a slow nod. "You're a long way from town. Just riding through," the man said. "Name's Jolin Bearclaw. I work with Judge Tawa Blackwind out of Laramie. We've been trailing someone. Heard you might have had a visitor." Koa's jaw didn't budge. "I don't keep visitors, just work the land." The second rider, Noden Sharpstone, glanced toward the barn. "You see a girl come through here, Apache. Maybe early 20s, said to be headed west, maybe limping, could be injured." Koa didn't blink. "You see any fresh tracks in this snow?" Jolin shifted in his saddle. "Ain't accusing, just asking. There's a bounty. Not for arrest, just for information." He added quick like it mattered. "Some folks just want to know she's all right." Koa studied them both a long moment. Folks who care don't send riders with rifles and bounties. The two exchanged a quick look. Jolon cleared his throat. "Look, Mr. Redhawk, there's a preacher's family back in Rock Hill. Lost a son in a robbery near Red Fork." He paused. Apache girl was seen fleeing the scene. Town doesn't care much about the details, they just want someone to blame. "So what's the truth?" Koa asked flatly. Jolon leaned forward slightly. "Truth is, that boy tried to take something that wasn't his, and the girl, she fought back." Koa's face didn't move. His hand stayed right where it was on the fence rail. Asha Rainbird stood quiet near the table, still as a shadow carved in stone. Koa Redhawk stepped through the door without a word. "They gone?" she asked. He gave a single nod. "Yeah." She didn't ask what was said. Didn't need to. She moved to the stove and poured 2 mugs of coffee. Her hands didn't shake. Not one bit. Koa sat across from her, took the cup she handed, drank deep. The silence between them wasn't cold, it was thick with meaning, with. Then finally he asked, "It was true, wasn't it?" What that man said. Asha didn't flinch. "The preacher's son found me down by the creek, told me he'd help, then changed his tune and said I'd belong to him soon enough. I ran. He followed." She paused, voice steady. "I had a blade." "You killed him," Koa said, not as a question. "I didn't wait to see." He nodded slowly. "You were right not to. That was it. No judgment, no fear. Just the quiet understanding of 2 people who'd seen too much to flinch at truth." The rest of the day passed like any other splitting, wood-checking traps, reinforcing the barn before the next storm. But the weight that had lingered since the day Asha showed up in his barn, it lifted. Finally. That night she didn't wait for him to come to her. She came to him. No words, no hesitations, only presence. They didn't lie together like fugitives or wounded animals. Not anymore. They were something stronger now. Something chosen. By spring, the snow was giving way. The stream out back ran bold again, and the wind carried the scent of wet earth and promise. Asha planted herbs by the window, some she remembered from long ago, some Koa had never seen. She carved bone tools for cooking. Koa built her a shelf just for drying leaves and roots. They rode to town together more often. Nobody asked questions. Koa's word was all folks needed, and when they noticed her, they looked once, and then looked away. The land had its own code. So did its people. By summer, the chickens had doubled. The garden brimmed with squash and potatoes. Koa added a second room, not for guests, just storage. They only needed 1 bed now. One evening, sitting on the porch with the day's last light glowing orange on his face, Asha reached for his hand. "You think we'll always be here?" she asked. He didn't even blink. I ain't going nowhere. She smiled, then not the kind folks wear for show, but the kind that comes from deep knowing. From being sure. There'd be no more running, no more barns, no more hiding. She was home. And so was he.